first threat came on a Tuesday. Daniel Mercer found it tucked beneath his windshield wiper, a folded sheet of paper that fluttered in the morning breeze as he approached his car. He almost mistook it for an advertisement or parking ticket, until he noticed his name scrawled across the front in a handwriting he recognized immediately. "I know where you sleep. I know where our children sleep. This isn't over. Daniel's hands trembled as he crumpled the note, glancing nervously around the empty parking lot of Westview Elementary School. He'd arrived early to prepare for his fourth-grade class, a routine he'd maintained for 15 years. But today, that routine felt violated, exposed. He didn't need a signature to know who had written it. Rebecca's handwriting was as familiar to him as his own. Sharp, slanted letters that seemed to cut into the page itself. They'd been separated for 8 months now, divorced for 3. The court had granted him full custody of their children, 10-year-old Lily and 7-year-old Noah, after Rebecca's increasingly erratic behavior had culminated in a drunken outburst at Noah's birthday party. That should have been the end of it. But Rebecca Mercer wasn't someone who accepted endings. "You need to report this, Dan," said Michael Hayes, sliding the note back across the kitchen table that evening. As Daniel's older brother and a detective with the Oak Ridge Police Department, Michael had been his rock throughout the divorce. "This is a direct threat." Daniel sighed, running a hand through his thinning brown hair. "It'll just make things worse. You know how she gets when she feels cornered." "Yeah." "And you know what happens when people like Rebecca don't face consequences," Michael replied, his voice firm but gentle. He'd seen too many domestic situations spiral out of control, had responded to too many calls that came too late. The restraining order clearly isn't enough. From the living room came the sound of children's laughter, Lily and Noah playing some game with Michael's son, blissfully unaware of the conversation in the kitchen. Daniel envied their innocence, their ability to find joy despite the fractured foundation of their family. "I'll think about it," Daniel conceded, though they both knew he wouldn't. He'd spent 13 years making excuses for Rebecca's behavior, minimizing her outbursts, hiding the bruises. Old habits died hard. "That's not good enough anymore." Michael leaned forward, his eyes intent. "You have Lily and Noah to think about now." Before Daniel could respond, his phone buzzed with a text notification. "Rebecca. Saw my children playing in your yard today. Enjoying your stolen family?" As Daniel stared at the message, 3 more followed in rapid succession. "You think you've won. You think they're yours." "Everything burns, Daniel." He wordlessly handed the phone to Michael, whose expression hardened as he read. "Tomorrow morning," Michael said, "we're filing a police report. No arguments." What neither man realized that night was that Rebecca Mercer had already set her plan in motion. A plan that would consume not just Daniel's life, but everyone connected to him. Rebecca had been the daughter of James Hargrove, one of Oak Ridge's wealthiest developers. Though she'd been essentially cut off after a series of scandals in her early 20s, she maintained connections with people who operated in the shadows of the small city. People like Victor Dolan, who ran security for her father's properties, but supplemented his income with work that required no paperwork or questions. "I don't want him hurt," Rebecca had told Victor 3 days earlier, as they sat in her car behind an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. "I want him destroyed." Victor had nodded silently, accepting the envelope of cash. He didn't need to know the details. In his experience, people like Rebecca Mercer, people with money and grudges, were best handled with minimal conversation and maximum deniability. "Make it look like he did it to himself," she'd added, a cold smile playing at her lips. "His brother's a cop. We need to be smart." What Rebecca didn't know was that Victor had his own history with Michael Hayes, a history that included an arrest 5 years earlier that had nearly put him behind bars. The chance to settle that score while getting paid was too perfect to ignore. The fire alarm at Westview Elementary went off at 2:17 p.m. on Thursday afternoon. Daniel led his class of 4th graders through the practiced evacuation route, counting heads with the precision of a teacher who understood the weight of responsibility. 23 children, all accounted for, all safely assembled at the designated meeting point on the playground. It was only when the fire trucks arrived that Daniel realized the smoke was coming from the administrative wing, near the principal's office, where he'd been meeting with a parent just an hour earlier. By the time the firefighters extinguished the small blaze, school was dismissed early, and investigators were already examining what appeared to be the remnants of an improvised incendiary device. Principal Eleanor Wright pulled Daniel aside as children were being picked up by concerned parents. "The fire marshal says it started in your mailbox in the staff room," she said quietly, her normally composed face etched with worry. "They found the remains of some kind of timer. Daniel, they're saying it was deliberately set." Daniel felt the ground shift beneath him. "That's impossible," he stammered, though even as the words left his mouth, Rebecca's text echoed in his mind. "Everything burns, Daniel." Later that evening, as Daniel sat in the sterile interview room at the Oak Ridge Police Department, the detective across from him, not Michael, who'd been deemed too close to the case, slid photographs across the table. They showed the charred remains of a device constructed from household materials, along with a partially burned note containing the same handwriting as the threat on his windshield. "Mr. Mercer, can you explain why we found traces of the same accelerant at your home in your garage?" Daniel stared at the detective in disbelief. "What? That's not possible. I never—" "We have a warrant, Mr. Mercer. The search was conducted this afternoon while you were here giving your statement." The detective's expression revealed nothing as he continued. "We also found a series of emails from your account to your ex-wife, threatening her if she pursued visitation rights. Care to explain those?" Daniel's world narrowed to a pinpoint of panic. "I never sent any emails. I haven't contacted Rebecca directly in months. Everything goes through our lawyers." But even as he protested, Daniel could see the skepticism hardening in the detective's eyes. Someone had orchestrated this perfectly, creating a trail of evidence that all pointed to him, and in that moment he understood with devastating clarity what Rebecca had meant. She wasn't going to physically hurt him, she was going to take everything else. The weeks that followed unfolded with the inexorable logic of a nightmare. Daniel was placed on administrative leave from the school pending investigation. The courts suspended his custody of Lily and Noah, placing them temporarily with Michael and his wife while the investigation continued. His reputation, carefully built over 15 years of teaching and community involvement, was shredded by rumors that spread through Oak Ridge like wildfire. Rebecca, meanwhile, presented herself as a concerned mother who had always worried about Daniel's temper. She appeared composed and sympathetic in court, describing a man consumed by bitterness over their divorce. Her father's influence secured her the city's most effective attorney, who painted Daniel as a manipulative abuser who had finally snapped. Michael worked tirelessly to uncover the truth, convinced that Rebecca had orchestrated the entire scenario. But each lead he pursued seemed to dissolve on contact, each potential witness suddenly unavailable or unwilling to speak. "She's always been 3 steps ahead," Daniel said during one of their increasingly rare meetings. Child Protective Services now supervised his visits with Lily and Noah, limiting his contact with them to sterile rooms filled with donated toys. "I just never thought she'd go this far." Michael had just discovered that the timestamps on the threatening emails allegedly sent from Daniel's account coincided with times he had been teaching, surrounded by students and colleagues. It should have been exculpatory evidence, but the prosecution argued that the emails could have been scheduled in advance, evidence, they claimed, of premeditation rather than innocence. "We're going to figure this out," Michael promised, though the confidence in his voice had begun to waver. "The truth has to matter." But in Oak Ridge, truth was proving to be a malleable concept, shaped by money, influence, and the court of public opinion that had already rendered its verdict. 6 months after the fire, Daniel Mercer stood before Judge Hamilton, listening as the verdict was read. Guilty on charges of arson, fabrication of evidence, and violation of a restraining order. His sentence: 7 years in state prison. Rebecca sat in the gallery, her face a mask of appropriate gravity that couldn't quite conceal the triumph in her eyes. Beside her, James Hargrove, who had never approved of his daughter's marriage to a schoolteacher, nodded solemnly at the judge's decision. Michael wasn't present for the verdict. He had been found unconscious in the parking lot of his apartment complex 2 nights earlier, the victim of what police reports described as a random assault. Though he survived, the head trauma left him with gaps in his memory and slurred speech, conveniently removing Daniel's most dedicated advocate just before the conclusion of the trial. As Daniel was led away in handcuffs, his last glimpse of freedom included Rebecca leaning down to whisper something to Lily, whose tear-streaked face turned away from her father in confusion and fear. Prison was both better and worse than Daniel had imagined. Better, because his status as a former teacher and brother of a police officer earned him protection from certain elements. Worse, because each day was a reminder of all he had lost based on fabricated evidence. For 3 years, he maintained his innocence through appeals that went nowhere. He wrote letters to Lily and Noah that Rebecca intercepted and destroyed. He documented everything, creating a meticulous record of the inconsistencies in his case, hoping someone would eventually listen. That someone arrived in the form of Eliza Chen, a journalist working on a series about wrongful convictions. Her interest had been piqued by the unusual circumstances of Daniel's case, particularly the convenient timing of Michael's assault and the irregularities in the evidence chain. The fire marshal's initial report didn't match the final conclusions, Eliza told Daniel during their third meeting in the prison visitors' room, and 3 witnesses who initially corroborated your whereabouts suddenly changed their statements within the same 48-hour period. For the first time in years, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. Rebecca has connections, but she can't have gotten to everyone. Eliza's methodical investigation began to unravel the careful tapestry Rebecca had woven. She traced financial transactions linking James Hargrove to the judge who had denied Daniel's appeals. She uncovered communications between Victor Dolan and members of the Oak Ridge Police Department who had handled key evidence in the case. Most significantly, she found Noah's former therapist, who had notes documenting the child's confusion about the things Mom says Dad did that contradicted the things Dad actually did. The therapist had been pressured to seal these records and take an unexpected sabbatical during the trial. "We're building a case for a new hearing," Eliza explained during one visit, her voice low despite the privacy of their meeting. "But these people are dangerous, Daniel. The more I dig, the more concerned I get about potential blowback." Daniel understood the risk better than most. "Be careful," he warned. "Rebecca doesn't just want to win. She wants to destroy anyone who opposes her." Eliza nodded, but her determination never wavered. Some stories need to be told, no matter the cost. Neither of them could have predicted just how high that cost would be. 5 years and 4 months into Daniel's sentence, Eliza Chen published the first installment of her investigation in the Oak Ridge Examiner, a comprehensive expose titled "Manufactured Justice: The Framing of Daniel Mercer." The article meticulously documented the fabricated evidence, witness intimidation, and corruption that had led to Daniel's conviction. It included sworn affidavits from 2 former employees of Hargrove Development who had witnessed Rebecca's meetings with Victor Dolan, as well as recovered text messages between Rebecca and a police evidence technician who had since left the department. The story exploded across Oak Ridge and beyond, picked up by national outlets and igniting public outrage. Within days, the state attorney general's office announced a review of the case, and Daniel allowed himself to believe that vindication was finally within reach. Then, exactly 1 week after the article's publication, Eliza Chen's car went off the road on the mountain pass outside Oak Ridge. By the time emergency services reached the scene, the vehicle had been engulfed in flames so intense that dental records were required to identify her remains. The official report ruled it an accident, a tragic case of a driver losing control on a notoriously dangerous stretch of road. But when Daniel received the news, delivered by a somber prison chaplain, he knew instantly what had happened, what Rebecca had done. His anguished cry echoed through the prison corridor, a sound of such raw grief and rage that even the most hardened inmates fell silent in its wake. The investigation Eliza had begun continued without her, carried forward by her colleagues and a growing coalition of advocates for criminal justice reform. The evidence she had assembled was too substantial to ignore, especially as public scrutiny intensified. When Daniel finally walked out of prison 7 months later, exonerated by a unanimous decision from the state appellate court, he emerged into a world that had moved on without him. Lily was now 16, Noah 13, children who had grown into teenagers with only vague memories of their father, uncolored by Rebecca's manipulation. The legal system that had failed him now offered apologies and compensation. The school district that had abandoned him now extended invitations to return. The community that had condemned him now celebrated his vindication. But these belated gestures of restitution couldn't restore what had been taken. 6 years of his life, his children's childhoods, his brother's health, Eliza Chen's life. Rebecca Mercer was eventually charged with obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and conspiracy, though the more serious charges related to Eliza's death remained frustratingly unprovable. Her father's influence secured her a plea deal resulting in a 3-year sentence at a minimum security facility, with the possibility of parole after 18 months. Victor Dolan, facing more substantial evidence of his involvement, disappeared before he could be arrested. His body was discovered 6 months later in the trunk of an abandoned car in a neighboring state, his death attributed to associates, unhappy with the attention he had brought to their other enterprises. 10 years after that first threatening note appeared on his windshield, Daniel Mercer sat alone on the porch of a small house on the outskirts of a different city, hundreds of miles from Oak Ridge. The evening air was cool, carrying the promise of autumn. Inside, Michael dozed in his wheelchair, his recovery incomplete but significant enough that he had regained much of his speech and some mobility. They lived together now, these broken brothers, supporting each other through the continuing aftershocks of Rebecca's vengeance. Daniel's phone vibrated with a text message from Lily, now in her first year of college. Their relationship remained fragile, constructed of careful conversations and tentative trust. Noah, still in high school and living with his maternal grandparents after Rebecca's incarceration, maintained more distance, still struggling to reconcile the conflicting narratives of his childhood. Rebecca herself had been released after serving 22 months. The terms of her parole prohibited contact with Daniel or the children, though occasional reports from mutual acquaintances suggested she had relocated to the East Coast, remarried, and somehow rebuilt a life untouched by the devastation she had left in her wake. The justice system had eventually acknowledged its failure in Daniel's case, but that acknowledgement had come too late for too many. Eliza Chen's parents had established a scholarship in their daughter's name for aspiring investigative journalists. The school where Daniel had once taught had created a program to help children affected by wrongful convictions. Small memorials to a tragedy that should never have happened. As darkness settled over the quiet street, Daniel reflected on the question that still haunted him. Was this justice? He had been exonerated, Rebecca punished. The system had eventually corrected itself, however imperfectly. But true justice would have meant none of it happening at all. True justice would have meant Eliza Chen living to see her 40th birthday. True justice would have meant Lily and Noah growing up with an untainted image of their father. True justice would have meant Michael continuing his career instead of struggling through years of rehabilitation. The machinery of justice, once derailed, could never truly be set right again. The damage rolled outward in concentric circles, touching lives far removed from the initial injustice, creating new victims in its wake. Daniel took a deep breath of the evening air, letting it out slowly. Tomorrow, he would continue rebuilding what could be rebuilt. Tomorrow, he would call Noah and leave another voicemail that might go unanswered. Tomorrow, he would help Michael with his physical therapy exercises. Tomorrow, he would go on, as he had learned to do day after day, living in the aftermath of justice that had come too late. The shadows lengthened across the porch as night fell fully, and Daniel remained sitting there, alone with the weight of a story that had no proper ending. Just the long echo of consequence, reverberating through lives forever changed by one woman's determination to destroy what she could not possess.